Stacktard Ted. It is Tuesday, the 18th of October. How's everyone doing? Well, it doesn't matter how you're doing. You got to be doing better than Zelensky's doing today. Yes, Zelensky. He's having a very, very bad week. Because you remember how the Russians were running out of this and running out of that and running out of everything? Guess what? They still got some. And it's falling all over Ukraine with a little special attention on Kiev the last couple of days. So, what is Joe Biden going to do to help bring peace to the region? Well, he's going to have a provocative NATO military exercise 600 miles from the Russian border. Yeah, that'll do it. That'll bring peace to the region. Let's just piss everybody off and ratchet up. Why, folks? Because they have no interest in peace. They don't want peace. Peace doesn't make them money. And they can't stand to have the country that is so corrupt that every NATO country is laundering their money through it have a chance of that being evaporated by being part of the Russian Federation. Now, it's interesting. I've said this yesterday. I'll say it again. I believe our Russian military aims are changing rapidly. I believe that they originally did not want Kiev. They did not want the whole of Ukraine. But the bigger pain in the ass that NATO makes Ukraine for Russia, chances are the Russians are going to say, hey, you know what? Fuck this. We're not doing it again. Let's take the whole country. And that's where we're heading, folks. That's exactly where we're heading. There's not going to be a Ukraine if we keep it up. Zelensky, what a fool. This gentleman had a chance for peace with Russia back in March. Boris Johnson told him, no, you're not going to take that deal. And Boris Johnson, of course, was listening to his masters at the United States. And it's incredible. It's wonderful. No peace in Ukraine. They could have kept Kherson. They could have kept everything except for the Crimea, which they already lost in 2014, and the Donbass, which they pretty much lost right off the bat. So why would Zelensky go for the deal? Well, money. Money and ego, folks. Money and ego. They're paving Zelensky's highway to hell and the highway to hell for a lot of Ukrainians. Now, we've heard everything about how there's low morale in the Russian army, how there's this, how there's that. I don't see videos being posted online of Russian troops sending a letter to Putin saying they're refusing to fight. That's happening with Zelensky's guys. They are getting together. They are saying, hey, we're not going forward because our officers have abandoned us. We don't have the supplies, and you're basically sending us in as cannon fodder. Now, this cannon fodder deal, where guys are being thrown into worthless attacks, apparently there's a leak out of the Ukrainian general staff that Zelensky is being pressured to launch an offensive towards Kherson and capture Kherson before the November elections. Biden and the Democrats and the few turncoat conservatives, the guys who are really Democrats, the rhinos, they need to have this victory to maintain power. Because let me tell you what, if there is no bounce for our buck, a lot of folks are not going to be voting for the people who did. And I look for the next couple of weeks. I mean, we're only, 2.5, maybe 3 weeks away from the election. This is going to become a bigger issue with a lot of people. And a lot of these darlings of the Democratic Party, their bases are turning against it. We saw this last week with AOC. Some of her folks just calling her out for supplying the Nazis in Ukraine. And that's a wonderful thing that they're calling out. Now, those supporters with AOC, we agree with them on that, or I agree with them on that. I don't agree with them on everything. And this is the problem. Too many people have been too lockstep and monolithic for too long. My views are conservative. They're not conservative on everything. And these Democrats, these left-wing shills, they're understanding that there's common ground. You know, I always get told that Republicans are the party of war. I mean, it's not a Democrat, FDR, that got us into World War II. It's not Democrats, JFK and LBJ, who got us into Vietnam. It wasn't a Democrat, Joe Biden, who gave us a big shit show at the end of Afghanistan. It wasn't Bill Clinton who made a shit show in Somalia. But hey, don't worry, man. It's you Republicans. You Republicans are the war party. And I will say there are some Republican names that jump out as being warmongers who will fabricate evidence. They'll do anything they can to start a war. George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush are notorious warmongers. And we'll just have to see. The thing, and once again, back to one of my recurring points, it's always amazing to me. Donald Trump is going to get us in World War III. Well, Donald Trump did not have us as close to World War III as Joseph R. Biden has us. And if you're a Democrat and you can't admit that, there's not much hope for you. The Doomsday Clock. Who here is old enough to remember the Doomsday Clock? The Doomsday Clock were a bunch of pundits, analysts who were trying to get a gauge on how close we were to nuclear Armageddon. And this clock would move up and move back and move up and move back. And Iron Maiden even did a song 2 minutes to midnight about the Doomsday Clock, about nuclear Armageddon and how just unthinkable it was. And, you know, now we're speeding it ahead. In fact, in my lifetime, this is probably the most tense things have been that we openly know about. Now, those of you guys who understand history, you'll look at Able Archer in the 80s. We were actually a lot closer to nuclear Armageddon. There's also the deal with the botched Soviet software update on one of their missile alert systems. And if it hadn't been for one lone colonel deciding not to launch because things just didn't match up with what he thought a nuclear exchange from the United States was going to look at, if that guy hadn't stood up, the Soviets would have launched, we would have launched, and we'd all be crispy critters. But as far as knowing about it, understanding it, being able to say, yeah, we got a problem, yeah, there's a lot of going on. This is probably the worst since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's reminiscent of the Cuban Missile Crisis because the Soviets placed a threat that we weren't going to live with in Cuba, and we got pissed about it. And we started doing all sorts of shit to retaliate and let them know that we weren't going to put up with it. Now, on the other hand, the United States and NATO decided to put a threat in Ukraine, and the Russians decided they weren't going to put up with it, and they're doing a lot of shit, including the fact that there's no blockade because there's no ocean to blockade the shipping. Instead, what they're doing is they're going in and they're taking out the places where NATO was putting their bases and where NATO was training the Ukrainian extremists and terrorists, because they are a terrorist state for numerous reasons. If you don't believe that they don't use terrorist tactics, then there's also no hope for you. Just who we are, just where we are. So it's interesting to see that what I was told was going to be a one, you know, in all these Telegram channels, where they're making predictions that the air raids and missile launches and all those things over Ukraine were going to last 1 week. We're now a week and a day. Or actually a week and 2 days going into it. So apparently Zelensky didn't figure this thing out too well. And if American intelligence could not see this coming and could not predict it, what does that say about our intelligence? What does it say about it, folks? Our intelligence allowed Kiev to have inferior air defenses. They didn't. They wanted tanks, they wanted javelins, they should have been asking for other shit. And they didn't. And because they were putting so much emphasis on getting tanks and other weapons. By the way, their tanks right now are about useless. The fall rains and the fall mud, the autumn where everything turns to a quagmire, is happening. I got a video off Telegram the other day, a column of Ukrainian tanks sitting in the open. The mud doesn't look bad enough to have installed them, but they're sitting in the wide open, in a field, perfect targets. I bet the Russians wish they had a A-10 right now. A squadron of A-10s could have lit that up pretty quick. But all that stuff is meaningless. The Russians aren't going to send their tanks forward and get them stuck in the mud. No, they're working infantry fights right now around Bakhmut, Artemovsk. That's on borrowed time. The Ukrainians are evacuating everybody they can, and even Zelensky says it's a critical situation. And it's going to be very much like Popasnaya. When the Russians captured Pasivnaya, they had the bloom or the flower. And what this is once they capture a road junction, a transportation hub, everything opens up. And you can go all the different directions and spread out your assault. And this is what happened when the Russians captured Popasnaya several months ago. Now, we're getting ready to see the same thing occur in Bakhmut. And it's going to be amazing. It's going to be incredible. Already seeing the Western media, Ukrainian media, well, they're one and the same. Because the Western media simply regurgitates everything the Ukrainian press tells them. They're already downplaying the importance of Bakhmut. This is always the way. When the Russians captured Krasny Liman or Kupiansk, nothing, not a big deal, not a big deal. But when the Ukrainians recaptured those settlements, it's amazing, it's incredible. Oh my God, we've got the Russians. This was such a terrible blunder to let this fall into our hands. It's all bullshit, folks. It's all bullshit. We're going to change everything. If you can read a map, and if you can look at where our roads converge, in a land warfare, those roads are important. Those roads are logistics. Town names on a map, for the Ukrainians, they're important because those are names of towns, villages. Those are things that they can use to show progress. The Russians are showing their progress in a body count. Pull back, let the Ukrainians come forward, let your artillery do the lifting. And these offensives that the Ukrainians have been launching are simply an attrition of their forces. And they're all done to appease their masters. The folks in Washington, the folks in London, Brussels. Those folks don't care about you. It's sad enough, I care more about Ukrainian soldiers than the EU does, or NATO does, or anybody in America. If you've got a Ukrainian flag on your profile, you probably don't know any Ukrainian soldiers or Ukrainian military or Ukrainian people. I happen to know all of them. Not all the Ukrainian people, but I know Ukrainian civilians, I know Ukrainian soldiers, and most of those folks, the army types, not the extremists, are good folks. And they're being used and abused by the extremists and by Washington. Washington's using everybody. Why? Because, well, this is a proxy war. Same sort of proxy war we waged in Afghanistan. And we see how that came to bite us in the ass It was a worthy goal, in my mind, to damage the Soviet Union because it was communism. And I'm just anti-communist to the core. What isn't a worthy goal is what we're doing now. And it wasn't a worthy goal to arm a bunch of jihadist radicals, because that has came back to bite us in the ass several times and continues to bite us in the ass. We spent money on them. We trained them. We trained these Wahhabists. We did all this stuff, and it come back to bite us in the ass. Now, we turned a blind eye. That's the cool thing. We turned a blind eye to Osama bin Laden being a jihadist. We turned a blind eye to a lot of these bad, despicable people who'd perverted Islam for their own gains. And we're doing the same in Ukraine. Let's give weapons to a bunch of xenophobes. A bunch of guys who worship Stefan Bandera, one of the worst people. One guy these guys idolize themselves by putting swastikas on their skin, on their tanks, on their insignia. Not just swastikas, but other Nazi paraphernalia, other symbols that the Nazis used. What could happen with us giving those folks a bunch of weapons and training? Nothing, right? Sometimes I think we need to understand what we are doing. Sometimes I think we react and do shit we don't need to do. Just one of those deals, folks. One of those deals. Well, folks, y'all have a good day. We'll see what happens tomorrow. Maybe we'll be shocked and the Ukrainians will launch this huge offensive in the mud. That should be quite interesting to watch all their stuff get bogged down and have artillery rounds or kamikaze drones wipe it out. Right now is not a good time to be a Ukrainian soldier or civilian. But the bright side is there won't be a Ukraine soon. There won't be a Zelensky regime. There won't be a right sector. There won't be an Azov. Because the Russians simply are not going to put up with it. And you need to thank your politicians for sending in tons of money and tons of ammunition and making Ukraine a target. If we had not intervened in Ukraine, there would not be a war now. Had the Ukrainians abided by the Minsk agreements, there would not be a war. This whole thing was terribly avoidable, but hey, Russia must submit. And unfortunately for the xenophobes in our own government, our situation in the world is waning. And a lot of it's waning because of the miscalculations of this war. The hegemony that the United States has been pressing is falling apart. And a lot of that is due to just how radical the left is in this country. We're going to mutilate genitals of elementary school students in the name of being progressive, in the name of being accepting. And we allow all sorts of shit that people look at and say, that's crazy, that's nuts. And we try to normalize it. And the rest of the world does not think like we do. The rest of the world is not as cavalier about a lot of traditional things. They're not as cavalier about real science. They're not. They're not as cavalier about the family. And they look at what we're doing and they think, what the fuck is wrong with these people? And that's diminishing us as a country on the world stage. Anyhow, folks, take care.